Hi everyone, welcome to the Swift Arcade. I'm your host, Jonathan Rasmussen. Today we're going to look at a really cool shimmer effect you can add to your iOS application, something like this. We're going to work in the CA animation layer. You're going to learn how to add some really cool background animations to gradients and really give your apps a really professional look and feel when it comes to adding that background skeleton holder until your data is loaded, and it gives a really cool effect. So come on in if you want to see how to add this effect to your apps. Okay, so we're going to do this in three parts. First, I'm going to show you how the basic animation works. Then we're going to make it work with auto layout. And finally, I'm going to show you how to use it in practice in your apps. Let's start with a new application. So let's fire up Xcode. Let's create a brand new app. Let's call it Shimmer Fun. Feel free to save it wherever you like. I'm going to stick it on my desktop. And in there, let's just go into our view controller, create some space by going Command 0, Option Command 0, and we are going to do our work in here. Now the first thing we're going to do is we are going to just add in a plain old label, because this will show you how the shimmer effect works. And let's not forget to add that label to our view. So if we run that now, what we're doing here is we're putting a label on the screen. We're going to do it manually with CG Rec for now. We're going to do it with auto layout later at a position of X of 0, Y of 80, just down a bit. And then we're going to set the width and height. And the goal here, or the way this works, is first you define the control that you want to appear on the screen. And then afterwards, you add the shimmer as a layer to the back of it. So now that we've got our label here, let's go ahead and see how we can add that nice shimmer. Okay, so adding the shimmer, I'm just going to copy in some more code here and let's see what it does. What we've got here is we're really going to add a gradient to the back of this label. So this is a gradient which is going to sit right behind this layer. If you don't know what gradients are, do check out my previous video on gradients. I go into excruciating detail how to create these things. But basically a gradient is when we take two colors and we interpolate and offset them, and it fills in a gradient from one to the other. So we're defining a gradient start point of X of 0, Y of 0.5, then 1 of 0.5. And this is the key line here. We're adding that gradient as a sublayer to our label. So what's actually going on there, if you read the Apple documentation, is when you add a sublayer to a current layer, that sublayer you just added, that sits on top of any siblings with the same view and their Z position. So this layer we're added is actually going to sit right on top and hide the contents of this label, which is okay. That's what we want for this placeholder effect. We're just going to put a layer on top. The reason why we need a label there with some text is just to give it some size so we know what we're working with. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to do that by taking this gradient layer we created and then adding it to something called a CA animation group. Now the way that works is we're going to define two animations, and this was what gives it that really cool effect. We're going to add one animation going from light to dark gray with the begin time of 0. Then we're going to add another animation behind that, offset just a little bit, and again from the dark gray to the light gray. We're going to group those together in something called an animation group, and then we'll use this feature later. If we had a previous group, we could do multiple animations. But really, that's what's going to give it that nice animation effect. Now, key to all this is once we've added it, is we need to somehow tell this gradient, hey, what's your frame going to be gradient, or how do we get the gradient to actually sit over top of this label? And we do that with this line right here. Label.bounds takes the bounds of the label and assigns it to the gradient, and then voila, we should be good. So if we run this now, let's see if we get some kind of effect on the screen, and we do. We've now got a nice, remember this is two animations, doing a gradient animation behind the scenes, perfectly masking our label. Okay, now if you look on the internet for examples of how to do this, almost everyone's doing it with CGRect and Core Animation raw values. And that's really cool. But in our apps, when we're building them, we really want to do this with auto layout because that's really how we build modern apps. So let's come in here, let's do this again, but now let's make it work with auto layout. And let's start at the top here and just see how we're going to do this. So here we're going to find a label and a gradient layer, just like we did before. And then here we're going to go ahead and do some setup and layout to set this up for auto layout. Now the key to making this work with auto layout is we can't set the frame of our gradient until our label has been fully rendered in the view. That's why you want to set the gradient's frame to the label's bounds in view did appear. This is when the label that we add via auto layout here is going to be fully rendered. It's going to have its position. It's going to have its size. That's when we can set it to the frame here. That's about the only trick you really need to be aware of. The rest of it is just straight up auto layout stuff. So in here, we're going to create our label, set it up for auto layout, give it some text. Here I'm using a preferred font size of large title. That's just setting the font in our label. Here's the same gradient we had before, adding that gradient to our label. And then again, just making that animation group. Here's the layout. We're setting up the auto layout on the label. Here we're just taking that label. We're going to give it a top anchor constraint just below the top here of 1 from the safe area. And this is just typical auto layout stuff. I've got a course on how to do all this. If you're not familiar with auto layout, it's a crucial skill. Do check it out in the course notes. But here we're just setting these things called constraints: leading, trailing, height. That's what's going to give our label, enable it to be fully rendered, positioned, and size. And then here's just that same animation group we saw before, along with some extensions for colors. So if we run this now, let's just see what we get on our screen. And what we should see is a label that's put there via auto layout with that nice shimmer behind it. And this time we've just done a few little extras like rounded the corners. That's what we did with this quarter radius line here. And that's how you can use this shimmer effect with auto layout. The way we use this feature in practice on projects is like this. Now that we know how to add a shimmer behind any control, we can actually lay out our controls or our views in two ways. One where a view is not loaded. In other words, this would be like a waiting state, as if we're waiting for a long network call to complete. And then two, once it does complete, we could change the state and present whatever it is we really want. In this case, the dates of some really cool computer arcade games that were created. That's how we would use this effect in practice. And it's basically doing everything we did before, just applying it to your specific layout. The one difference here is you can notice now that we have multiple cells on this table cell row, notice how the animation of this one is different than this one. This is what's going on in that really cool animation group layer I was talking about. What I've done here also is I've extracted that method called make animation group into something called skeletal loadable, a protocol. And this is how we do inheritance in Swift. We define a protocol. Via the extension, we add some functionality to that protocol. And then on whatever component we'd like to have this functionality, we make that cell implement that protocol. For example, down here in my skeleton cell, which I'm going to go through in a second, by implementing that protocol, we inherit that functionality. And really the magic of how to make that dual animation happen is that's what's going on in our make animation method down here. These are the lines I skipped previously. What we're doing here is if we have a previous animation group, we're offsetting the time of the one we added by 30.33 seconds. And that's what's making this one shimmer differently than this. So let's go see how all this works. I've got my same view controller here. I've created a struct called game, which just defines these the data I'm loading into my table here. I then load this into my view controller. This is typical UI table view stuff. The thing to understand now is we've got two table view cells we're rendering. One is this one when I actually have data, and two is my skeleton cell ID for when I don't. We're going to put in two different table cells here, one for when we do have data and one for when we don't. That's what this load button is doing here. It's just toggling the state, which I'm using to track this table view from one to the other. Then in here, it's just basic table view setup stuff. We're setting up our table view data sources ourselves, loading in 2 cells, our custom and our skeleton cell. And then we're just setting the view to be the entire table view itself. That's why it's filling up the entire view here. And then here, this is just table view stuff, where basically when we ask a cell in our table view to load, we're taking a look at our loaded state. And if we are loaded, we just bring in our typical custom cell, which we've defined like this. It just has a title label and a year label. And when we pass in the game, it just sets the text on these two. That's how this custom cell works. And then on our skeleton cell, if we're not loaded, we are going to display that one. And this is just making use of all that cool gradient animation stuff we just looked at. Here we do our layout to match the real cell that we want. So we have a title label and a year gradient, a year label and a year gradient. That's what's defining these two right here. And then when we go in here and we do our layouts, we're setting the bounds, we're rounding the corners. But the key thing I want to show you here is how we did the animation group stuff. So here, just like we did before, we make one animation group for the title. That's what's making this one shimmer here. But then we take that group and we pass it back in to make animation group, and it uses this group's time for the year group, and this is what offsets it by 33.33 seconds. That's what makes one control shimmer slightly different than the other. Really cool effect. I really like how this was done, and yeah, it's just a really cool looking effect that this is how we would use this in our actual applications. Well, there you have it, folks. One way to add some really cool looking placeholder animations into controls in your app to give it that nice loading state while you're waiting for things to happen. Apologies, I know I went through this rather quickly this time. I'm just got a lot of work on a project I'm currently working on. I'm also working on another course on data structures and algorithms in Swift. If that's something you're interested in, do hit like, do hit subscribe. It's coming. It's a lot of work. It's going to take a while, but I'm really hoping that's going to help people with their technical interviews. But anyways, if nothing else, you've got some nice ways to do some shimmer and some placeholders on your iOS apps. All right. Thank you so much for coming, everyone. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.